Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
And this is Gender, a Wider Lens, a podcast dedicated to the shifting concepts around gender in our contemporary culture.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we seek to open up the discourse around this hot-button issue.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens.
Hi, Stella.
How's it going, Sasha? How are you?
I'm doing well. It was really interesting to talk to Maron today.
Maron gives us a really good glimpse of what's going on all over the world, in schools around the world, where people are just trying to look out for their kids and make sure that, everybody's getting a good education and that we're allowed to kind of speak up when we need to, when we disagree. And people are being shamed for it. And Maud Maron is not shamed. She keeps speaking up. But what was done to her, as we'll hear in this episode, was pretty horrific, if you ask me.
Yeah, so she was, initially interested in getting involved with schools around things like merit and academics and the way young people are assessed in schools. And then her daughter went to high school and had to give her pronouns in every single class. So this is what sparked Maud's interest in what's going on with schools and gender. And as you'll hear, she was kicked off of a school board because of something she had written. And she recently posted on September 4th that she got restored to her elected school board seat. So if you want the backstory of that, you can hear it in today's episode with Maud. And it's interesting because she's one of these great examples of how people who are firmly within kind of the political left end up finding contradictions and a lot of kind of aggressive behavior that makes people feel like they need to leave that political party. And this is a common story that we hear over and over.
As well as that, when you listen to Maud speaking, and you realise that she just has a civic nature. She's thinking of the greater good, and she's thinking of how to improve society, and she just is that way inclined. And then when you hear her outline the demonstration that happened to try and silence her, and you realise that the tactics, they're dirty tactics, and like a kind of a hateful rhyme that she discusses called "Hey, hey, ho, ho, the hateful ho has got to go." Like it's like something out of medieval times. So yeah. All under the auspices of we're the good guys, we're the self-righteous ones. So I think if anybody from the left is uncertain about what's going on, I think listening to this episode will give an insight into why some people are feeling very disaffected by the tactics that are being used to squash any sort of dissension.
Yeah. She's also the president of Third Rail, which is an ideas consultancy that creates environments where ideas and not ideologies can work in service of a strategy and organizational success. Maud began her career as a public defender and later served as an associate clinical professor of law at Yeshiva University. And she also led Manhattan's largest school board, as we talk about today, advocating for merit-based admissions in NYC specialized high schools. And she co-founded something called Place NYC, which is a parent-led education advocacy group. And she ran for Congress and city council as a moderate Democrat and has recently become an independent. So we hope you enjoy our conversation with Maud Maron. Before we dive into the conversation, we want to take a quick moment and thank our sponsors, GenSpect and Therapy First. GenSpect is an international organization committed to fostering a healthy approach to sex and gender. GenSpect will be hosting the Bigger Picture Conference in Lisbon, Portugal this September. To learn more about who will be speaking at the conference and to order your tickets, visit genspect.org.
Therapy First is a non-profit worldwide professional association of mental health providers who view psychotherapy as the appropriate first-line treatment for gender dysphoria. Therapy First supports psychotherapists working with gender dysphoric youth and young adults and offers public education on mental health and psychotherapy. Visit therapyfirst.org to learn more. Now here's the conversation. Hi, Stella, and welcome, Maud. We're so glad to have you.
Very happy to be here.
Yeah, I met you at Dissidence in New York, and I'd been watching you online for a long time, and I suppose we all kind of semi know each other in this world. But
Yes.
I think you can give us a lot of insights into schools today, what's going on with them, where they've gone wrong, where we could work with them, how people should be working with them, because little did we know schools were going to be a frontier that we needed to deal with in a
Right.
way that we've never had to deal with before. So we're delighted to have you. What first kind of brought you into the kind of school world? What was it that made you become part of the school board?
Sure. Well, I have four kids and they're all in public school. Actually, one graduate as of this year. My eldest boy is just graduated high school. But I'm a parent. I'm a parent of four kids who have attended public school in New York City. My first bits of sort of involvement, not even activism. It was really more volunteerism before you get to the stage of activism, before you get to the stage of advocate, before you get to the stage of dissident. It all starts with a little bit of volunteering to make the schools better, to be part of a community. And it's and I've had tremendous joy in being part of my various different parts of my kids' school communities. Great teachers, great fellow parents, great administrators, some clunkers along the way, but some really wonderful people that I've worked with and that I've, I think tried to make some change for the better. When I first started paying attention to what was going on in the schools, it was really around our process in New York. New York is the largest school district in the country. We have almost 1 million kids. It's been going down since COVID, but also then going up because we have a lot of migrants, kids coming into the school system, but it hovers around 1 million kids. That's enormous. Yeah. The other big school districts in our country are like a few 100,000 are the other big ones. We have a unique system. I grew up in Pennsylvania, where you go in most other states, if you're in a public school student, you sort of know where you're going to go to school from kindergarten or pre-K through 12th grade. In New York, you apply into middle school and you apply into high school. So before kids ever apply to university, they've done that application process, and it's a little convoluted and a little complicated. And some of my early work on a community board and then on a school board was about preserving what worked in that system and fighting off the bad changes that were coming. And it was really, in a nutshell, around merit. It had nothing to do with gender at that point. I don't think I was even really aware of the notion that, gender was brewing as an issue that middle schoolers and kids would be thinking about at the time. All my kids were in elementary school, and it was about like, well, where are they going to go to middle school? When they're 8 or 9, where are they going to go to school when they're 10, 11, or 12? And it was the moment where academic merit was coming under attack. And it was this whole conversation about equity and racial justice. And it was about getting rid of merit-based exams. And I got very involved in that and wound up co-founding an organization with other parents to preserve various schools in our school system that were academically strong and good, right? And my idea, and it remains my idea to this day, is you look at a school system where a lot of students are failing and you want to help those kids that are failing. You don't target the kids who are succeeding and say, let's tear apart those schools. Let's call them racist. Let's make other stupid, spurious accusations at the successful kids and tear them down. That, in the nutshell, what was going on. Back when I started the organization at the time, I probably wasn't so succinct about it because we were all trying to talk to not offend the social justice crusaders, but to try to talk the language of the left in this way that soothed the people who you didn't want to rile because they were in charge, and that experience, and I mentioned it in some detail, is because it translates into it was the groundwork of understanding how and it's the powers that be that are in charge of the school system still to this day that have, we haven't exactly solved, we have a terrible literacy crisis. We haven't solved all the academic stuff that we were working on, but it very much was the groundwork and got me familiar with how that education world was working when the gender stuff sort of exploded.
I love your the name of your organization, Third Rail. I think it's very cool.
Thank you. So the advocacy organization I found was called Place. Third Rail is a consulting organization that we definitely do welcome ideas. We call ourselves an ideas consultancy. And part of what that work is like not being afraid of ideas and creating environments where people can talk about ideas.
Great idea. Well, great idea. I'm very interested in that because I thought that, Ireland would still have some, because it's old fashioned, some vestiges of common sense, and it wouldn't really hit us, this kind of moving away from merit, but my kids they're 16 and 15 and they've done their exams, and I look at their school reports and I have no idea whether they're good or bad. For example, A, B, C grades all gone. They've never seen a grade, A grade, B grade, never seen them. So they don't know what they are, Sasha. So when I say, where's the A's and B's? There is no A's and B's on the report card. What there is like H1 and N1. And what does that mean? What does H1 mean? What does meeting expectations? This rambling. I don't know what meeting. Whose expectations are they meeting? Do you know what I mean?
Right. And what are the expectations? How are they meeting them? Whose expectations are they? What do they prepare you to do?
These are children who are, I would consider, grown up in an old-fashioned town in Ireland who don't know what an A or a B or a C or a D or a fail is, because they've actually never experienced it. And that blew my head off, that it came in so fast, that the education system has changed so fast that they don't have a concept of failing exams. That isn't something that they do. And I'm interested in that woman, Catherine Burblesing, and her strict school. Do you know that woman?
Yeah.
She's kind of, and a lot of the independent schools in England, they're kind of bringing in very much where you're coming from, as far as I can gather, Maud, which is kind of old-fashioned education, teaching people, giving them grades, as opposed to the new way, which I find difficult. Go on, Sasha. Give us your best.
Ask? I mean, to just to ask about the other side, what would you say is the most generous interpretation for, like, why might people want to do away with A, B, C, D? I mean, I'm just curious because I know some of these policies, let's disagree with them, let's debate them, but what's the best reason that people came up with to suggest this huge change?
I mean, I've gotten very bad at the good faith counter arguments in it because I see so much, like, for me, I'll give you an answer, but I'll say also, like, it's hard for me as a parent not to notice that getting rid of grades removes accountability from politically powerful actors. The teachers' unions in our cities contribute an enormous amount to political races. The teachers' unions, by and large, have been, and let me say, my kids have had many, many great teachers, have many great teachers right now as the school year starts up. But as a political force, the unions have always resisted they don't want promotions or salaries or tenure tied to, academic success of kids. Yeah. And sometimes that's fair, right? Like, two-parent stable families in high socioeconomic communities are going to do better with a crappy teacher than poor kids who don't have enough food on their table, whose parents have moved around a lot, with the best teachers in the world. So there are inequities in terms of judging teaching that you should take into consideration that are real and that are important. But across a whole, school system, when you're looking at it, when we're looking at the learning loss from COVID and everything, like, standardized testing plays an important role, not just for parents to know how their kids are doing, not just for kids to know how they're doing themselves, but how we as consumers of this big product that we pay for, are we getting our money's worth? Are they teaching our kids how to read? Are they teaching our kids what they need to know? It dovetails with, you guys, of course, know Abigail Shrier because of her brilliant book, Irreversible Damage, but she's written a new book called Bad Therapy, and she makes some very compelling arguments in it. And one of the things she talks about is sort of this gentle parenting movement that came up. And I do think, Sasha, to your point about, like, well, what's the good faith? Well, I think good faith people don't want to send kids into a school system to be a competitive rat race where they're stressed out all the time about whether they get a good grade or not. They want kids to genuinely learn and have a love of learning and experience joy. And that all sounds good to me. But if your way to get there is to take away all measures of accountability and not to give kids the structure that Catherine, I don't know how to say her last name. How do you say it?
Burblesing.
I've heard her speak, and she's great. And I wish we had her counterpart here. I mean, we have it in various places, but people who say, I have high expectations for you kids. I have high standards, high expectations, and I have faith in you to meet them. That's a gift to kids that I think is a much better gift and has a better payoff and has better in the moment, structure for kids than this whole like, we're going to follow your lead, meet you where you are, never stress you out, do all this stuff. Because it's like, when you tell a kid, I have faith in you, you can do this, you know how to do this, that kid's much more likely to stretch towards a goal in which they can ultimately feel proud of. Versus Stella, my kids had grades early on, my older kids. And then when COVID hit, the folks who wanted to get rid of grades replaced it with all that meets expectations, that, this and that. And across the board, only the families who are able to remediate the loss aren't behind. Like the kids who just had to rely on public education all through COVID, their learning loss is real, and they're very far behind where they would have been had they been in the classroom.
And things like achieving, I didn't know the difference. And I'm educated, and I didn't know the difference between achieving and meeting expectations. So like in one subject they're achieving, and the other they're meeting expectations. It's like you feel like you're trying to penetrate corporate speak.
Right.
When you know what I mean?
It's
and
meant
then
to obfuscate a little bit and not let you really know what's going on.
Well, and there's a new thing with schools which is really noticeable. In the parent-teacher meeting, they're all doing very well. All the kids at all times. And like, it's like, well, no, they're not. I happen to know these kids.
Right.
There's some subjects they're not doing well in, and some subjects they're very good in. But no, you'd never know from the parent-teacher meeting, because they've been kind of very much taught, and it's very disconcerting because you get this feeling of, I don't know what you're trying to tell me. Mm-hmm. You're hiding behind jargon, and I can't figure out. I don't know whether they need help. I'm happy to help them if they do, because I can't penetrate your language.
Right.
Because you're saying,
wow, that
things
sounds
like she's
familiar to us.
Yeah, she's doing well for her abilities. She's working to her ability. She's working well within her ability. And I'm like, what does that mean? I don't know. Do you know what I mean?
Wow,
it feels,
so
it actually, do you know, more than anything, it's anxious making, because you don't know what you don't know. Yeah. You don't know what you're missing. And I just think, well, what about people who don't have English as a first language? They must just go, what the hell? Totally. Yeah.
Well, that's what in New York, and Sasha, to your point, there's a lot of the dynamic that I discovered in the academic sort of advocacy that we were doing, that it was like a pattern when the gender stuff was, when you see it in the school, and the language, and not being really hiding behind jargon and that kind of stuff. It was like, oh, I know what you're doing, because I saw you do this with grades and learning and standards and merit. And now you're doing it again here. You have a different agenda than what your language is letting on, to be a little cynical and a little.
So you decided to join the board. You decided if you can't beat them, join them.
I ran for my school board in 2017, and it was not a gender conversation at the time in New York. Certainly there were some families going through it, but it hadn't sort of exploded in the popular conversation, culture wars of New York City yet. And it wasn't on my radar as a mom, and it wasn't something I was focused on.
When did you start to see the gender stuff? And it seems like you already had like a template, like you understood it because you had seen it happening before with things around merit and other kind of metrics. So what happened around gender?
For me, it was like academics and merit. That was the, gateway advocacy in schools. And then it became open our schools, because they closed down schools in New York with COVID. And it was like unmask our children. They masked toddlers in New York, and they were the last to be unmasked. I mean, it was really crazy. My youngest son was 3 in March of 2020 when the schools closed down. And then, he never went back to nursery school. And his first day of pre-K, his teacher came out with like a face shield on and a mask and a thing. It was all so bizarre. It's a little bit like the frog being boiled in the water. Like, if I think about it now, I should have just gotten the heck out. Excuse me. I should have just left. It was so crazy. But it was like one little, it was first we're going to close for 2 weeks, then they closed the parks, then they closed it, then you have to wear masks, then you have to stay home, then it was like one little thing after the other. And so then it was like we were already a group of parents because we were fighting about the quality of the education. They were trying to get rid of gifted and talented programs in New York, trying to get rid of entrance exams to our STEM high schools and all of these different things. We'd already found a community of parents, and many of us were on the same page, not all, but many of us were on the same page about reopening the schools and COVID. And so we were holding rallies and writing and like writing op-eds and speaking to elected officials about opening the schools, getting the masks off our kids, not mandating vaccines for athletes because they were, private and parochial school kids didn't have the same number of restrictions that New York City public school athletes did. So we were just like, It was one bad policy after the other, and we were fighting it all. Then you're sort of in a, I was in this community of people who were getting the hang of putting pressure on elected officials and raising issues and raising the profile of issues. And, my daughter went to middle school, and it was hard not to notice a few years ago that half the girls in a school were LGBTQ-ish on some level. It was trans, it was bisexual, it was they, them pronouns, it was, all of this stuff. And I feel very lucky that I read Abigail Schreier's book around this time. So I wasn't I feel like I benefited enormously as a parent from the fact that other people had gone through all this craziness and had talked to Abigail had put together this primer so that when parents were as a parent for me, when I saw this stuff in my kids' schools, my daughter's first day of high school, she came back and said to me that every one of her classes, because it's a different, you go to different classes, they had to give their pronouns. So that's 8 times in one day in your first day of school that you're going through this crazy pronoun ritual. But I felt like as a parent, because I had read Abigail's book, because I had other people had gone through this kind of craziness, umbrella term there, craziness, but that I was able to sort of understand it as part of a bigger picture and a whole pattern, and then be able to talk to my kids about it and talk to all my kids about it. My son, my other middle kid, my son had a teacher in his middle school who clearly wanted to talk about trans stuff. It was a trans man, in other words, a woman who was, my son's teacher for a particular class. It was a push-in class. It's called RAP, RAPP, Relationship Abuse Prevention Program. It's certain number, once a week, or it's not a core subject, but had this teacher who as far as I gather, presented very much like a man, and then did this little exercise with the kids and brought in, let's bring in baby pictures, and brought in baby pictures that have the kids, and the baby pictures of this teacher were little girly pictures and pink and clear. It's how it is. There are some people who really like to draw attention to the thing that they're doing, which is living as the opposite sex. And my son, who's 14 now, was 12 or 13 years old. And I just wound up having that conversation with him. And I know what it was. That he said to me one time that kids in the class asked their teacher if men could get pregnant. And the answer was it depends. And they had a whole discussion about it versus no, only women can get pregnant. So I wound up having a conversation with my son, who was, 12 or 13 at the time, about why that's just not true and how only women can get pregnant. And we talked about how, I don't want my son to say anything disrespectful or rude to this teacher. One, because I don't want my kids to be disrespectful or rude to anybody, but also because you have to navigate a school system the same way you have to navigate a professional world or something. There's sometimes you got to pick fights, but not all the time. And you shouldn't do it unnecessarily. And so with my son, I had this conversation about if that person could get pregnant, it's because she is female and she has a uterus and she can, and her reproductive system allows her to get pregnant, even if she's injected hormones and grown a beard or wears boy clothes or calls herself a man or the only way a person can get pregnant is if they're female. So I feel that sounds so silly. If you had told me when my kids were starting kindergarten that these were the sort of conversations I would have to have with them, I would have thought you were crazy, right? But now you really do have to have those conversations with your kids, and to say, just call the teacher by whatever they say their name, they're in this situation. If it was a core curriculum, so maybe it would have prompted me to more reach out to the school or have a conversation. But this seemed to me superfluous and silly. And I was like, the best thing to know is to know that sometimes you're going to have to navigate odd situations like this, especially living in New York City in 2024.
Do you have any kind of approach that you would recommend, because you've been on school boards and you've come to harm really with these school boards, and we'll go to that in a moment. But if a parent was navigating, because a lot of parents are navigating, where they feel teachers are overstepping and they feel that people are really kind of impinging on their parenting, is there a way to deal with the school that you think actually works?
There's a couple different things, and it's really hard. And I think, Stella, you said earlier, you're thinking about parents trying to navigate looking at a report card if they're non-English speaking, if they're not, like, parents can be alienated very easily just from the basics. And then when you go to this complicated subject, it gets much worse. I think if you have a gender distressed kid or gender confused kid or something, and you think the school is hiding things from you, I think just get your kid out of that school. And I know that's not easy for people. And I kind of hate when people say to me, homeschool. I think, no, I'm not going to homeschool. Like, my kids need their school community. It works for some people, and that's great if it does, but it wouldn't work for my family. It doesn't. But so in a case where you think your kid is really being led down the primrose path by teachers, I would get your kid out of the school. But if it's more of an issue, like on this case with my son, I didn't even bring it up with the school because my son is fine. He's not remotely confused about the difference between men and women. It wasn't the issue. We have other things we're working on and other things that are important. I think the most important thing is to, like, shore up your kid. Like, for me, the conversation with my own child was the most important thing in that situation. But in other cases, I email the school. I email the school and I say, this has come to my attention. Or, like, for instance, when my youngest son was in kindergarten, we had this new curriculum come into the school called the Mosaic curriculum. One of the books and I saw it online, one of the books, and I literally saw the books come into the school, is a book called The Transgender Story. I'm Not a Girl, a Transgender Story. And it's a little, girl who doesn't want to play princess. And it's a picture book, and she cuts her hair and she wants to, play with the boy toys. And so by the end of it, she has a new name and her little friends are calling her by that new name and she's happy. I sent an email to my principal and I said, hi, I noticed that on your kindergarten reading list, I'm Not a Girl, Transgender Story is on the reading list. I don't want that read to my son. I don't think it's appropriate. I don't think it's fact-based. I don't think it's true. Little girls who want to cut their hair short and don't like pink are not boys. They're just little girls who don't want to cut their hair short and play with pink. And I don't want that read to my son. And they did not answer my email, but they called me in for a meeting. We sat down and had to make it. They generally don't like to write about these things, but we had a conversation and I walked out of there and also I've known this teacher for a long time. It's different when you're meeting people for the first time versus when you know people. I've known them for a long time. I walked out of there feeling very assured that that book would not be read to my son or to that class at all for that year. And I think you have to be, as a parent, just like do that. Just say, like, I'm not happy with this book, with this, behavior, with this thing. And this is why. Please don't do it. And then the ball's in their court and they have to respond to you.
Yeah. It's tough because I think when parents, like your example here, your son isn't specifically questioning his gender. So, I mean, the stakes are not as high. And you're an assertive person. You've been involved with schools for a long time. So it's probably quite natural for you to go in with a kind of meeting like that and a request like that. And a lot of parents that we work with who have, for the most part, had no issue with the school, all of a sudden, if their kid starts questioning their gender and they realize there's maybe some influences at school that are not helpful, they all of a sudden have to become this, like, really assertive person. and they're quite scared. And
Yeah.
I mean, my understanding of the New York school system is also that schools may also feel like their hands are tied to some degree when it comes to the gender stuff. And so
Their
some
hands are
conversations,
tied.
yeah. So, I mean, I've had conversations with parents who they're nervous that coming into the school with really assertive requests might actually flag them as like, quote, toxic parents or transphobes or something like that. So, of course, it depends a lot on the relationships they have with individual staff and teachers and counselors.
Right.
But, you get a certain type of school counselor who is a kind of zealot. They're an advocate for the kids. They think they're the savior of the trans students at school. And this could create a really difficult dynamic for the parents. So, do you have any advice for people who are in that more extreme situation?
It's brutally hard, and it really depends on if you know. There are two things I would suggest. One, if you have an ally in the school, a teacher from another year that had your kid, a specialist, a reading specialist, or someone that works with you, like talk to them and ask them to maybe join the meeting with you. If you set, if you set up a meeting, because I think meetings are really important. The other thing to do is reach out to an outside person, ask to have somebody come with you. And it can just be your more assertive sister-in-law. It can be someone else, because people don't have to feel alone in a meeting, because a lot of parents, you're right, I am assertive, and I'm like, a lot of people don't want to be that person. And having someone else in a meeting, you have the right, you're the parent, you can absolutely bring anyone to a meeting with you. You can bring an outside advocacy group person to a meeting with you. Principals may say, oh no, this is just for parents, and you can always say, this is what I'm comfortable with, and I want this person here with me. You have the right to say that, and they need to let you have whoever you need in the meeting. So don't go alone if you're nervous or feel uncomfortable.
And can I just hop in and say, Jen Specht has ran that school advocacy, and it's worked so well because so many parents just feel paralyzed and frightened. And
Right.
just to have somebody who's very kind of diplomatic and very, or, maybe a doctor or a therapist, somebody who's actually professionally able, and the parent just says, I just don't feel up to it. This person is advocating for me. That's the only kind of fence you have to cross, because the advocate will do an awful lot then.
Right.
I think there's huge worth in that.
It is very tricky in the New York City schools right now. And we have this situation right now that for parents who actually do just want to have a conversation or say, I don't think this is good for my kid, or like, if you have a kid who the other kids are using a different name for your, these sort of like gateway transition moments, like your child's using a different name in school or this or that. I think it's the New York City school system has made it really difficult for parents who in good faith, some of whom don't yet know what the right answer is, right? Some of these parents are thinking, well, maybe transition is the right answer for my kid. Maybe social transition, maybe it isn't. There are a lot of good faith parents who like haven't reached a conclusion yet. They should be able to talk to a school in good faith. But our particular moment in time, our chancellor has responded to two things. One, a newspaper article about me, and I'll run through it, Sasha, but like a newspaper article about me and some other school parents where we said some quote unquote transphobic things, and also a resolution that was passed in my school board about boys and girls sports. He has responded to those things with such a hardline, super leftist position of anyone who dares to question the most like extreme trans position, ideology, is a transphobe and a bad person and hateful and bigoted. And he has responded in that way that makes it really hard, I think, for parents that they know what they're up against. They know if they raise their hand and say, I'm not sure this is good for my kid, that the risk of being called transphobic or bigoted, or worse yet, having people decide they're transphobic and bigoted, let's cut them out of the things that were the decisions we're making about their kids in school. It's a real risk. And I think it should be illegal. I don't think you should be able to practice sort of psychotherapy and social, psychological practices on kids when, one, you're not trained for it, two, you don't have the parents' permission, and three, you're not held accountable for the outcomes that are sometimes really catastrophic.
Well, that's so huge. That's such a good point, because something we've explored on the show in the past is that, like, actually social transition is a psychological intervention. And you're right. The
Huge.
schools are not accountable in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years when that young person is kind of walking in a particular direction that often leads towards medicalization. So that's a good point.
This is such a fascinating conversation. Listeners often tell us they feel frustrated by the lack of nuance around this issue, and they feel afraid to speak their minds.
And they ask us how they can help to bring more clarity to this difficult topic at their workplace, in their kids' schools, or with their own friends and family. Well, here are 3 things you can do right now.
1. Follow. Wherever you're listening to this, take a second to click like, follow, or subscribe.
2. Share. Send this podcast to anyone who you think might appreciate it.
3. Join. Support our efforts by becoming a paid Substack supporter. Go to widerlenspod.com now to subscribe.
Now back to the discussion.
So then talk to us about the story of how you ended up. I don't want to spoiler anything, but something happened to you at a school board that you were part of. Tell us what happened. First of all, you obviously had been working successfully on the school board for some time, and then
you'd started an organization, and you were really and you ran the Democratic ticket. You'd done a lot.
Absolutely. I have been on this school board, which is for District 2 in Manhattan, so the largest school board in Manhattan. This was the 3rd term I had been elected. These are 2-year terms. And I was naive and earnest as I can be sometimes, trying to pursue an improvement in math instruction in our district, because I've seen it with my kids. My son's off to study engineering in college. Like, we really can do better. We're failing our kids in terms of not having high standards. But in December, the term started in July of last year. In December, an article came out. Do you know the news periodical called The 74 Million?
No.
It is. It started as a kind of an education periodical in the United States that would be considered kind of center, but it has drifted left, as so many things have. And they published this frankly ridiculous article in December of last year that profiled me and 2 other people, all of whom had run for office as Democrats. Actually, Andrew Gutman in Florida. I don't know if he ran as a Democrat or Republican. He was a Democrat, as most New Yorkers were at some point, and then some of us get chased away from the Democratic Party. But myself, one other woman on my council, and Andrew, who had gone to Florida, had been in a chat. The chat was an Unmask Our Toddlers chat, as I mentioned to you, in the fight to get out of crazy COVID restrictions. But like everything these days, somehow the subject of gender identity came up, and we wound up talking about trans stuff and gender identity stuff. And I wrote in that chat something that I will always say in
a WhatsApp chat type thing.
In a WhatsApp chat. It was like a group chat of parents just chatting. And I said, they were talking about trans kids in school. And I said, there's no such thing as a trans kid. And I said, that some of these kids were that this socialization was leading to hormonal and surgical outcomes that meant these kids didn't have like healthy adult sex lives, and that they were really being harmed. I said it then, I say it now, I think it's true. They printed this article, they reached out for me for comment about it. They printed it as a real gotcha, as if they had discovered the true transphobe nature of Maud Maron.
Yeah, that was my question. Did somebody from the chat like screenshot and send it to the journalist?
Exactly. And the thing is, what happened, and this is what happens, in a way I don't mind. It's yucky and gross for people to screenshot a chat, but we were off topic of the chat. It's true we were off topic, but I think there were a lot of younger moms who had, preschoolers and kids affected by this masking thing. They wanted out of the masking thing, but they haven't really gone down that path of realizing these are moms of 2 and 3-year-olds, not middle schoolers and high schoolers.
Yeah, of course. How big was this chat? Was this a huge chat or
No, like probably 30, 40 people. Like big enough to be, but not, and a lot of the people I knew and some of the other people, but there were some newer people like joining the group. And anyway, they published this article. I thought it was ridiculous, and I also thought I stand by every word I said.
Yeah, it's not a gotcha when you would say it publicly. I mean, that's
the way I felt about it. But that's exactly my stance. And then, but the chancellor at the next public event discussed it, and he said parents have been saying things in private that are not, he said we want people to behave like adults and they're not today. And he didn't say my name in particular, but it was so clear he was talking about the parents in that article that the 74 million updated their article to report on what he was saying about it. So it was very clear, like a very public reprimand. And again, I don't so much mind for me. I've had people, who disagree with my positions yell at me before, but it sends a clear message. As you were saying, Sasha, there's other parents out there that are trepidatious about talking to their teachers, their principal. It made it really clear that there's only one way you can talk about trans kids, issues of kids transitioning, and it's to be all in hard on like trans, kids know when they're trans and we have to affirm them and respect them and it, which of course is the exact opposite of what we should be doing. But like he made that clear. Then there's some very left leaning people who adopt that sort of super gender ideology conversation on my council. And they started trying to pass a resolution, like a gender affirming resolution with all the trans language. And then I was like, okay, well, I'm fed up with this. Like, I'm certainly not going to vote for this. This is actually bad science, it doesn't belong here. I didn't bring it up, mind you. This was so then I said, I'm going to write a resolution, because that's what these councils do. We don't have a lot of official authority. We don't pass budgets. We don't hire and fire superintendents like other school boards do. We're advisory. And so I wrote Resolution 248, which was short and sweet and said, girls' sports have taken a long time to get here, and I traced the history of when the New York City Public School Athletic League was founded, how girls, even after Title IX passed and girls were supposed to get equal funding for sports in federally funded institutions in America, there was still the New York Civil Liberties Union had to act on behalf of girls in New York City to try to get equal access to playing fields and stuff. And so girls have had to fight in New York to get the girl athletes to get the equal, opportunities that they're due under law. And so I wrote that out. And then I said, the resolution said, we should revisit the 2019 gender guidelines that had said, you go by gender identity, not biological sex. If a boy says he's a girl, it means he's a girl, blah, blah, blah. And I said, we should revisit that. And this time invite female athletes, coaches, parents, relevant doctors to the table to have the conversation. So it didn't even come down in a position one way. Of course, everyone who knows me knows I have positions, but if you actually read the resolution, it was really a very gentle, very polite, and very respectful request for a conversation. It passed my council 8-3. And that's because people who know very little about gender stuff think it's reasonable, generally, to ask for a conversation that's inclusive and that includes impacted parties. That made so many people so angry in New York City. And if, I don't know if you guys link to things and when you post this, but if you actually post the resolution, it's so milquetoast and it's so benign and it's so respectful. And when I tell you the number of people who are furious about it, it's absurd. The contrast between how benign it is, the request for a conversation, and the fury that it generated. 18 officials, including our longest serving U.S. congressperson, signed a letter saying it was hateful, bigoted, and discriminatory to ask for this conversation. These 18 politicians signed this letter and sent it to our council saying that we should repeal this resolution. The chancellor swooped in and said that he considered it, he's the head of the whole New York City public school system. He said he considered it rescinded, and he, no way, no how was he going to let female athletes have a conversation about what these gender guidelines meant for them, for their lives, for their sports opportunities, for their scholarships, for their privacy, for their dignity, all of the things that I think a responsible head of a school should be willing to talk about. He said, no way, no how. And then what else?
While you're thinking there, I think that point about it being milquetoast is very important. I remember when I did the film Trans Kids in 2018, and it was so milquetoast. It was so much effort into being kind of very, very gentle, just asking a couple of questions. We're
Right.
just tiptoeing in. And I got slammed for that.
Right.
And I thought, wow, there's real strategy in this. If they slam people like me
Right.
and you who are asking very gentle questions,
Yes.
people just shrink away because it's like, that is so frightening. I better not say a word because I have no idea what is the right word. Because
Right.
people like Stella and Maud got hammered for really benign things. I wouldn't be able to say it's so benign, so I'm not going to say a word. It's very, very powerful as a tactic. And it's very
Yeah, you're very
unpredictable
right about
because
that.
you can't, you just think there are no words I could have made to make it gentler. I couldn't have made it gentler that I could think of, that I could still
Right.
ask the question. I don't know what the formula of words were.
But to be honest, I suspect that there are a few really extremist ideologues who actually read the wording of either
Oh, yeah.
your
Or J.K. Rowling's
your
essay.
resolution or actually watched your film.
Right.
But then what they do is they put their spin on it and they call
know.
it these really inflammatory names. Anti-trans, hateful,
Right.
etc. And then
Bigot.
they just have to share their opinion pieces in one or two places, and then people who otherwise have always trusted their in-group say, oh my goodness, I don't like anti-trans
Totally.
hateful bigotry, let me get behind this, without actually reading it. So I suspect that
I
there are
agree.
probably a lot of reasonable, moderate people who falsely trust the specific interpretation of a few like LGBT activists. Because like, oh, you're an LGBT activist, you must be
An expert in this
insightful
area.
about what
Right.
this shit really means. Like,
Right.
oh, she says this, but she really means this. So,
Right.
I just think there's a way that these things snowball way out of control. But you're right, the chilling effect is powerful.
Yeah. I think you're right, Sasha, but I do think that Stella kind of hit the nail on the head with it as a political strategy. It's that Overton window, right? Because if we say, you know what, we should talk to female athletes about how these gender guidelines impact them. Well, if you have a rational conversation about that, it would mean you'd have to look at things like the Cass Review or these other like credible sources of information that tell you like, well, what is the actual, like, what should a school rely on in terms of research and policy and having a policy about gender distressed or gender confused kids? And once you open the door to anything other than the extreme ideological position, a lot of the stuff that's been going on has to crumble because it just isn't supported by robust evidence.
So come on, tell us what happened then.
Oh, yeah, well, I knew when it was on the agenda that it would provoke a lot of outrage. And that was, I think it was February or March of this past year. And we got, I don't know, 15 people, 20 people, including Chase Strangio, who, if you know who that is, it's a lawyer. Chase is a lawyer with the ACLU who had a still rather shocking quote about Abigail Schreier's book saying that it was a hill he would die on. To keep it out of stores, out of people's hands. And the ACLU is, of course, used to be revered in the U.S. as a First Amendment, a free speech organization. And so having a lawyer saying, like, I'm going to censor the shit out of this book was a little bit, like, confusing for people who think of the ACLU as free speech defenders.
Just to jump in, my husband lived in America for about 20 years, and at some stage when we were first getting to know the gender debate, he said, Jesus, Stella, you've got to contact the ACLU. They're going to sort it out. I was like,
look, first time I was chased out of a work environment, people said to me, oh, call the ACLU. And I thought, oh, you poor soul, you're living about 20 years behind the times. The ACLU would be like chasing me down the road with a pitchfork because I have the wrong opinions. But the thing is, they came, they spoke up, they were unhappy about it. And then they came back the next month and the next month with more and more people. And they just, to the point where, and then the chancellor said, like, I've read this resolution. It's rescinded. I don't consider it. I'm not acting on it. You can't win a bigger political victory than to have the person in charge of a system say, I'm 100% with you and I'm 100% against these other people. Yeah. But they had it was the first chink in the armor of gender ideology in the New York City public schools. And they were like, alarmed and furious and sort of like high on their own supply of like, we're going to get her, like she can't do this. And then they came to a meeting. It was the May or June meeting. I can't remember which one. I think it was the end of May or beginning of June. But anyway, the very end of the school year. And they got their biggest group ever. And they had instructed everyone to wear white. They came with the trans pride flags, and they came with signs, and they were like really geared up. And this was a meeting of our school board that the chancellor was coming to. And basically, it was one of the more bizarre school board meetings, I think, ever in New York City, in that we have public speaking sessions, which anyone who goes online is used to seeing that in school boards. There were two different things at this meeting that went so off the rails. One is they brought very young kids, and I find that to be awful. So they brought these young kids, like elementary school age kids, so little boys who are dressed up in girl clothes and who've been told their whole lives by their parents that they're girls. And there was these, young people who were speaking about how important. So you had a very, very young person saying like, how could I play on a boys team and I'm not a threat to the other girls and da-da-da-da-da. But this is a prepubescent young child who's doing the sort of the trans ideology talk. I just think it's awful and wrong and bad for that little human being. Yeah. So that was going on. And then what would happen is there are groups like Gays Against Groomers, like groups that are people who are really opposed to trans ideology, who in another moment of intersectionality in our school, it's like, oh, you're Black and lesbian and so New York City person speak. You in the other parts of leftism, that's a person that you're supposed to listen to and respect their lived experience and then this and that. But when the Black lesbian comes and says, hey, I agree with this resolution, I think we should revisit gender ideologies, that person gets booed and spoken over and so in the weird political reshuffling that trans does, a lot of people that would have otherwise been respected and listened to get shut up. But at this school board meeting, what happened is every time someone who wasn't all in on the Chase Strangio gender ideology, mindset, the whole group of people, well over 100 people in this room, would stand up, most of them wearing white, turn around, put their back to the speaker, and start humming, like this weird, creepy humming that was going on. I had finally decided, okay, I invited some people who I respect and who do good work in this area, people like Kara Dansky, Kim Jones of Icons, like people who were close enough, like not as far away as you, Stella, but like who live in New York or near enough. And so some people came and also some New Yorkers who just live locally came and spoke and said like that a young high school student came and spoke who was just graduating from high school, who said, like, I think we should talk to, like, athletes should be part of this conversation. Every one of these people, when they got up to speak, this group would turn and start their humming. Wow. We had to interrupt the meeting, break up the meeting. We had, like, security come in. We had to kind of negotiate that they would let other people speak. And the fact is, I'm a First Amendment person, a free speech person, like, I will always fight for the right of people who I strenuously disagree with to be heard and have an opportunity to speak. And it just, I don't know, it's just so, I don't know what I want to say pathetic, but it sounds mean or dismissive, but like, it's just so ugly and wrong to be like, I have so much faith in my ideas. I'm wrong about some things, it happens, but like, I have so much faith in my ideas that I will go talk about my ideas to anybody who will listen. And the people who won't do it, the people who think we have to drown out other ideas rather than listen to them and engage in them, it always makes me wonder, like, how much faith do you have in your ideas or your position?
Can I clarify? So you're at these meetings and the meetings were getting bigger because more and more kind of trans activists were coming with their children, and at first they were speaking, like the kids were speaking up, but that wasn't strong enough to kind of defeat you. So then the next month they brought these hummers effectively, and they were wearing white, and when somebody that they didn't like was speaking, they'd stand up, put their back to the audience. And how many
Yes.
was there? Like, how many was in the meeting, and how many Hummers were there in white with their backs to the wall? And then would they sit back down as soon as the person stopped, and then just kind of listen very sedately until the
When
next
they're
Hummer?
that is all true. That all happened. There were at any one time 50, 60 people standing up and turning their
Oh my
back.
God.
Maybe a little bit more. It's a big
Do
auditorium.
they have their eyes
this
closed
auditorium.
or open? Like when they're turning their back?
Oh, and their eyes were open. They were saying, because some people filmed it. There's a lot of it got posted on Twitter, and you can see them. But it was very raucous, extremely raucous. And there was another one. I always mention this because it's so gross. But at the meeting with the chancellor, this was in our school board, a few of the different council members, myself included, get to ask the chancellor a question. I wanted to ask the chancellor about the math program I've been trying to establish in the school. And when I started to speak, the crowd was ready. They knew I was going to speak. And this super pro-trans group, supposedly, started chanting, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, the hateful whore has got to go." Yeah. So I was like, just to be clear, I was in my children's school. I had 2 children in that school. My kids weren't there that night, but this was their response. Thank you for responding that way, because the chancellor took it in his stride. He didn't think much about people speaking to a parent in the school district being treated like that. It didn't seem to bother him at all. But I think it's pretty shocking. And these are the people who want to say,
they're on the side of love, and
compassion,
inclusion.
kindness, inclusion. Thank you, Sasha. All those. These are the good people that we should be listening to, but that's how they speak to and about a mom that they disagree with, So that's who they show you who they are.
That's awful.
It's pretty unbelievable to think about that. I mean, that's such a sexist thing to say. I mean, there's so many layers of why that's really troubling. I think a couple of really interesting things stand out to me about this. And I remember seeing the video, and I remember when I was scrolling through X and this video came up, I clicked on it before I even read the context. So all I saw was
Me too.
I mean, it's a very theatrical and dramatic display of all these people in white humming in unison.
Yeah.
And knowing what I know about gender activism, I think, wow, this is such a great demonstration of how thought-stopping cliches operate in this belief system. You're not allowed to think about or consider any ideas that may challenge your dogmatic beliefs. The wearing of all white, I mean, it's this kind of like, we're a cohesive group that have the same thoughts about everything. We have one identity. Nothing can challenge it. So there's a lot about it that feels like religious zealotry.
Purity.
Yeah. But I have to say, to be totally honest, when I saw it, I thought, actually, this is aesthetically very moving. Before I read the caption, I clicked on this image, and the sound was like this overwhelming, it's almost like calming. Obviously, it's disruptive because you can't hear anything over it. And I thought, wow, you can see these are theatrical drama kids. They're creatives. They know how to put on a show. And there was something incredibly moving about the display. But then you realize what they're doing is they're stopping people from thinking and considering, and it's so culty. I mean, it was just, it was a remarkable thing to see for lots of different reasons.
It was very powerful.
I had a slightly different response. I was the same as you. I clicked on, didn't really know what was going on, but I got chills of, this is so creepy. I just felt so creepy. And I had no idea, because it was hard to follow it. It was like, what? But I got a real strong creepy, but it reminds me of, like, back in the day in Ireland, and I grew up hearing all these stories of, women who had children out of marriage being denounced from the altar, and in a really, really pious and sanctimonious way. And people in the parish all joining in and the woman would ultimately leave and usually go to London or go to America, but she would be a shamed woman and her life would be over. And the piety and the sanctimony that drove those women out while they were being treated so badly. Now, this is obviously decades ago, but it was so pervasive and so strong in Ireland that like women did not survive a town by being
That's
married.
so
They just
interesting,
didn't.
Stella.
So similar.
Right. I mean, that's clearly like 100%. That's what they're trying to do to me.
Yeah.
And to the other people. I will say this, it's not all about me. There are people on my council who voted for the resolution, even people who didn't write it or sponsor it, voted for it, who have suffered some sort of professional repercussions because they voted yes on a resolution that said, can we have a conversation about guidelines that were passed 5 years ago? That's all it said, talking about milquetoast. There was another member of our council who was removed from a community board he served on, which is a volunteer position in his community. There was another woman who lost a prize that she, in a Sikh civic association that she was part of, that she was supposed to get. There was another woman who was, she's not even on Twitter or social media, but she got they looked up her place of employment. It's like the old school cancellation technique. They looked up her place of employment. They tagged her employer. And they tagged her, and she's not even on, her place of employment, saying, do you know you have this transphobic woman working? She works in commercial real estate, and she had to go in and meet with, people at her workplace to explain why they were being tagged with allegations of supporting transphobia. And she doesn't even have Twitter, or like she's not even on social media. She was like, but she read the very rational. The funny thing is, this particular woman, read the resolution as I wrote it and she said like, oh, I played D1 field hockey. D1 is the highest sports level in our university system. And she said, sports was such an incredibly important thing in my life. And I think, of course, like female athletes should be included in this conversation. Like she had such an earnest, normal response to the idea of what we were asking for. And then all of a sudden she finds herself being called into the general counsel at a commercial real estate place where she works to have to talk about transphobia. It's like, that's how we're still like, I don't know how to get from there to a place where we can protect young people from the horrors that I see still going on.
We're coming towards the end. What was the upshot? What was the fallout? Because surely the outcry on Twitter of horror, I would have hoped, might have slightly shamed that school that had this extraordinary tactic.
No, New York is, there's still, I think, a lot of people in New York who just don't really know what's going on with that gender stuff, or they know somebody who has a gender non-conforming kid and their family's navigating it well, and they're sort of like, oh, so-and-so seems lovely. I was talking to someone today who said to me, oh, she has a kid who's like, you would think he was a boy, but he's not, but everybody, like, in his school is really lovely about it. It's all fine. Like, some people just see sort of the upside of a positive situation somewhere, or they've never heard about it at all, or they're deep in the culture war one way or the other, right? So in New York, it really hasn't. I feel like we're very far behind Europe in terms of where, and that's true about the United States more broadly, but in New York in particular, as I see it, in the day-to-day. Ultimately, I was removed from my school board, and I think it was largely because of this gender stuff. And I'm challenging it in federal court right now. It was actually because of a comment. The stated reason in the letter that they sent me was because of a comment I made objecting to anti-Semitism in an op-ed in my daughter's high school newspaper. So they were unhappy with something I said. I think had they not been looking for a reason to remove me, they probably would not have noticed it or cared about it, but they were looking for a reason to remove me. And what I said, this really horrendous op-ed was written and published anonymously, and it said things like they wouldn't condemn what happened on October 7th because you can never condemn resistance, and things like, basically denying that rapes took place on October 7th. And I said that the byline should read coward instead of anonymous if you're going to, reprint Hamas propaganda and Jew hatred. At least put your name to it. And which is a strong statement, but it's also protected free speech. And I've been elected to school boards in that school and reelected. I've been actually elected 3 times by the parents of that school board to represent that school. And the chancellor said I was targeting and bullying a student. And I said, well, one, I don't even know if it was a student who wrote it. The byline said anonymous, and I was referring to the content the odious content of the op-ed as Hamas propaganda and Jew hatred. And the chancellor said, you were bullying a student, even though it's an anonymous person, and I don't know to this day who wrote that op-ed. And he said, you have to be removed from the school board as a result. So I was removed from the school board. I think, and pretty much everybody who's paid any attention to this at all, I'm quite certain that had I not offended all the powers that be by advocating for changing, for reviewing the gender guidelines and making any necessary changes, that they wouldn't have been so laser focused on the way I worded my critique of the anti-Semitism in my daughter's school newspaper. So that's the fun of New York City school politics.
What a story.
Wow.
Yeah.
Chilling.
Well, it's not good for free speech. Speaking of what we talked about earlier with ACLU, like we are in I don't have the statistics on the top of my head, but the young, I'm a Gen X, mom, the younger generations are less impressed or less concerned about free speech.
Yeah.
They've been sold a bill of goods with the idea that you can have a First Amendment carve out for hate speech, which of course you cannot. You can't have. And actually what I see going on in Europe is in England in particular, is pretty horrifying, with people getting arrested for Facebook posts. And I think in our, we have an obligation to teach our young people, particularly in the United States, about what the First Amendment means and why you defend it and fight for it, because otherwise you can't say what you mean and say what you think, and that's not living free. That sounds dramatic, but it's true.
I'd like to talk more about that, because something that, I've thought a lot about is just contrasting what I have always thought of as the liberties that we get in this pluralistic, individualistic culture. And my parents are from Egypt, and I often think about what my life would have been like had I been born there. And of course, I think there would have been some things that would be beautiful and wonderful, but I'm always so grateful that I live in a society where each individual can say what they really think and express themselves. And more, especially around this gender stuff, I see something so oppressive and terrifying. And I'd love to kind of flush that out together with you in the exclusive content. But before we go in our main episode, we like to ask people if there are any interesting podcasts or films or books or anything that you've been consuming lately, whether gender related or not, that you want to recommend to our audience.
As I was saying, I've been reading Abigail Schreier's book, Bad Therapy, and I find it really, really fascinating. And I recommend it completely and totally. But one thing that I think is really interesting for parents, whether it's a gender distressed kid or a parent of a kid who has, any other issues going on, it really does. It's a very good message for parents to hear that, you don't need to outsource the decision making to other people about your own kids. Your kid better than anybody else. And sometimes they really just need to hear, these are the boundaries of what's acceptable. And there are some kids that have very, very severe and real depression, and obviously you need professional support in many of those cases. But in a lot of the cases now, why some kids are being the mountain of ADHD and the stuff that's going on, sometimes what kids need is better, parents with stronger faith in their own ability to be parents. It's I don't mean to sound negative towards parents. It's ultimately a very positive saying that, you don't need that therapist to help your kid get through this rough patch. You can do it. Your kid, and it is a very reassuring message.
Thank you. Parents have lost so much confidence in the last 20, 30 years, and they've felt disempowered, and they've been kind of emasculated, or certainly they feel very downtrodden. So anybody who kind of is me and Sasha do it a lot, just trying to empower parents to kind of follow their instinct. Your kid better than other people. And sometimes you just have to kind of gird your loins, and you are good enough. You're as good as anybody else. It's such an important, it's been a continuous societal push to kind of reduce authority on parents, to the point now that parents presume somebody else will know better. When actually they're in a much. But thank you, Maud. Chilling story, but it it was well worth listening to it.
So sorry, I didn't mean to cough while you were speaking, but thank you very much, Stella. Sasha, it's very, very lovely to talk with you
Yeah,
both.
lovely to talk to you too. We'll keep the conversation going. So if anyone wants to join us, please go over to the exclusive content where we keep talking with Maud Maron. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And be sure to visit us on Substack by going to widerlenspod.com. There you can join our listener community, access bonus content and resources, plus learn about additional ways to support the show.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.